One of the things that I talk about is that spark we call life. The Creator, He put it in everyone's hearts. And that gift starts out very small. It's how we look after that spark in our life. If we're very angry, that spark is very dim. But if we're loving and caring, that spark is really bright. Your job is to protect that spark, and after a while, that gift will look after you. When I was a young police officer, a lot of the kids that we dealt with in the early 70s and 80s and 90s were survivors from residential schools. And they had a lot more baggage than we realized. I wish I would have been more compassionate. And so what I tell people now is when you see these youth coming into your schools or in the hospitals, you're not looking at one generation, but you could be looking at 3 generations. And really, it's for people to have an understanding that everyone has a story. When we meet people for the first time, I always say that you're going to meet 2 people, the person that you can see and the person that you can't see. That everybody has a story. You should think, how did that person get to this point in his life? What is their story? So when you see somebody coming into your buildings or your offices, you need to look beyond what you see. That everybody has a story. That's what this training's about, is understanding people's stories so that you have an understanding of the behaviors. Aboriginal people were targeted to be destroyed. And who we are now is not who we are. When we talk about our communities, most of the times we only see the behaviors when we see the news, complaining, or we're dying, or we're dead. And we only understand the behaviors. So when we see them on the street, we only have that understanding of that behavior. An anthropologist one time told me, he says, once you lose your culture, then that will be filled most of the times by alcohol and drugs. And in our community, we have lost our culture. My father was a residential school survivor, and I had asked him when I was a little kid, why didn't you ever teach us how to speak the language? And he said, why would I put you through the same thing that I went through? You don't need to learn that language. And really, I did need to learn that language. And when I was a kid, that was the last thing that we wanted to be, was a Anishinaabe person. We were embarrassed about who we were.
My mom didn't drink at all, but my dad was an alcoholic, and he really struggled. My dad seemed like a very happy person when it was just us, but every time he was under the influence, he was angry. The night my dad did pass away, he was under the influence, and I wish I would have known what I know now then, because I didn't notice the signs and effects from residential school. A lot of people don't know about residential schools still. Sometimes I don't understand how you wouldn't know about something like that, but it's because a lot of people keep this as a secret. They don't talk about why they're so angry or why they're hurting. I think that's something that we as Anishinaabe people have to understand, is that we need to keep educating ourselves so that we can educate others. I think a main part to my healing journey was engaging with my culture. My mom always talked about how the water provides life for all creations and how it purifies everything.
So in our stories or our history, we talk about that circle that we come into. So we put you in a large circle here this morning. And when you come into the circle, you can't hide behind anyone. You can't sit in a corner. That everyone's voice is important. So when you get a chance to go to a community and sit in their circles, that's so important. And I tell people that's how we healed many years ago, that we need to bring those circles back into our communities. One of the things how society broke down our communities was erasing that circle. In the middle of the circle was that drum. They considered the drum as voodoo, as something that wasn't part of the Catholic Church, wasn't part of any church. You weren't allowed to go to powwows. More than 20 people coming together at one time without an Indian agent you could be charged for. And there was other things in the Indian Act forbid you to speak your language. And later on, they started to take our children.
My ceremony is to go in the bush and hunt, and that's how I take care of myself. For me, it's just like it's a special moment. I get to reflect on everything, think about the good things that happen in my life, and also think about the bad things. Try to let it go in the bush. It's a very big part of my healing. My dad went to residential school. For a while, my dad had a hard time telling me, about what happened to him. Didn't want to think about those times again. And it was real sad, me and my dad never cried in front of each other before. It was a very strong, very powerful moment. The Indian agent came to their camp and they got threatened. His grandparents told him, Sammy's a very good helper in the bush. He brings food to the table. He hunts very good. He's a fast learner. He helps around camp so much. People like having him around, but his parents couldn't. We were just afraid. They thought this was the best idea for our Sam. It's a lot different now. He likes to talk and he just likes telling stories about the bush. And his stories taught me how to hunt. I want to teach my kids too someday, and I want to teach other kids and try to direct them to the right path.
The approximate number was 150,000 children attended these residential schools across Canada. So what happened, I would come into your community and say, how many children do you have? She'd say, well, I have 2 children between the ages of 5 and 16. Then I would say, I would take in your children. If she says, you're not taking my children, then I would place her under arrest, failing to provide education under the Indian Act. And anything that we agreed upon in the treaties becomes null and void. So it was a lose-lose situation. When they went to the residential schools, children were stripped of their culture and their language. No connection to your family. If you had a little brother, you wouldn't see him there. If you spoke your language at the residential school, they'd whip you, put pins in your tongue, make you eat soap, or they'd beat you. So you didn't want to speak your language when you finished residential school. And I would say all of these kids suffer from post-traumatic stress.
My grandmother and my grandfather, they went to residential school for a long time. They had a lot of problems with alcohol. So my mom grew up in foster care. And she went from home to home, and she had, I guess, like kind of a turbulent childhood. But seeing what she was put through, she always vowed to never let myself or my sister see that kind of lifestyle. And she always made it her goal to give my sister and I the childhood that she never had. Out of all her siblings, my mom is the only one who really, chose to basically end that cycle and keep us within the culture and raise us in like that good way of life. And I'm grateful for that, because now my sister and I, we both have that foundation to stand upon, and that's really important. There's a reason why our people are struggling, and it is a result of residential schools. They're not choosing to be stuck in a never-ending cycle. They're not choosing to be unhealthy, and they're not choosing to be addicted. But it's a lot harder when there's so many underlying issues that need to be fixed. You can't just tell someone, get sober and everything will be fine, especially when you're dealing with intergenerational trauma. And with residential schools, we learned, well, I guess our people learned a lot about negativity and learned a lot about violence, and we learned a lot about not expressing our emotions, because if you cried you would be beaten even harder, or if you cried you'd be locked down in a basement for days. When all these children, they left these schools and went back home, they grew up, they didn't have those coping skills that we learned in the culture. We lost a lot of really great things that were seen as, less than. And when you lose the things that are your foundation as a human being, you lose yourself and you lose the way you were meant to live. And you're gonna end up with unhealthy coping mechanisms. You're gonna end up turning to drugs and alcohol because you don't know how to deal with what it is you experienced. You're not gonna know how to communicate in a healthy manner. You're gonna resort to violence. And you're gonna pass that on to your children, and that's all your children are gonna know. And then they're gonna pass that on to their children, and it's just gonna keep going until someone says, this is wrong, this is unhealthy, and until we get back to the way we were before all this happened, it's gonna be an uphill battle for a lot of people, especially for those who don't know that our culture is what is gonna save us.
So the last piece I want to talk about is the ripple effect. Why are we doing the same thing that when my father and my grandfather and probably my great-grandfather, and the guy said to me, he said, well, let's take a stone, we'll throw it in the water, and it'll send a ripple out from that. And even if you can't see that ripple, that'll affect the river forever and ever and ever. And that rock that's gone in there will slowly make its way all to the bottom of the river, and that will affect that river forever and ever and ever also. So he says, let's look at your family. I said, okay. So out of the 15 of us, both my parents are now since gone, but out of the 15, probably 13 had some form of addiction in my family. So I never drank, never smoked, but I still had some alcoholic addictions in my behavior as growing up. And so he says, so what your dad was gifted, he gives to the next generation, that generation gives to the next generation, that gives to the next generation. In our communities, we say 7 generation. One man's voice and one man's actions is going to change 7 generations to come. And you could see that ripple effect in our communities now.